Blood loss is by far one of the most iconic stat effects in Elden Ring, and for a good reason. It is really good, probably the strongest one of the game, and blood loss has always been a staple of FromSoft games since at least Demon Souls. Now, blood loss is stereotypically usually seen with two stats, either a Dexterity build or an Arcane build, and there's a good reason for that. It's because these builds oftentimes run them pretty well. I mean, a lot of Dexterity weapons have innate bleed buildup, and Arcane can actually scale the bleed stats effects on weapons that have an Arcane scaling. However, that doesn't paint the full picture, as there's hundreds of ways to approach a bleed build, most of which are not only viable, but they're really good, in fact optimal even. And with Shadow of the Erdtree, there's now even more ways to approach a bleed build that used to not be viable in the past. And in this video, we are going to be covering the 5 main attributes and discuss the best ways to apply blood loss with dedicated builds within each of these attributes. We are also going to be ranking each one of these builds individually based off their merits and how viable they are as a bleed build and as a bleed setup. Now, before we start it off, please note that all of these are viable, so if something ranks lower than what you would want or you anticipate, please note I'm not calling it bad, I'm just saying that I believe a lot of the other options are better. And unfortunately, we do have to start off with the worst option, which is going to be Intelligence. Now, here's the thing, Intelligence doesn't really have that many innate blood weapon options outside of maybe the Moonveil, and that is so low that you're probably going to kill the enemy before you actually proc blood loss, unless you're on lower levels or if you're not really running an optimized build, which is totally fine. There isn't really much power in bleed build when it comes to the weapons on an Intelligence setup. And while you could go and grab something like katanas or scythes, these yield very weak or minimal results when it comes to an actual bleed build. In fact, the best route is going to be the Aberrant Sorceries. It is the best you got. Now, with this route, there's two ways you can optimize it. You go for full damage, you go for the Intelligence build to get the minimum amount of faith you need, or you could go for a Int Arcane hybrid. Now, here's the thing. This setup used to be absolutely broken in previous patches, most because of the fact that the Impenetrable Thorns was way too overtuned and it was bugged where it would have the hitbox hit multiple times. However, now it is still a very good sorcery. It just has a lot of other issues that come with it, specifically from the fact that it has some tracking issues, and if an enemy dodges, it will spread out to the side, causing most of your projectiles to miss. And unfortunately, this sorcery does have some pretty bad recovery frames, but it does do a lot of damage. So if you can actually use the sorcery and you could use it efficiently, it is really good. But because it has an issue handling things like dodging, as well as it has some pretty poor recovery frames, I actually do not recommend it for PvP, and for PvE, you might actually want to use a summon in order to make the most out of it. There's also one other major weakness of this build, and that is the fact that you will damage yourself over time when using these sorceries, which doesn't really do much damage, but the big weakness with this is the fact that it makes something like the Ritual Sword Talisman pretty much unusable. And because of all these shortcomings, including not having a weapon, not able to use the Ritual Sword Talisman, as well as the fact that it's not really great for PvP, I had to rank it the worst on the list. Now, let's go ahead and look at number 4, which is going to be a Faith or Faith Arcane hybrid. Now, this Faith hybrid option is really good because it has several legitimate options, including weapons and spells, and beyond that, it gives you a lot of versatility beyond just the blood loss. But first, let's look at the worst part of it, which is going to be the Blood Flame incantations, which used to be really good. Swarm of Flies used to be one of the best ways to proc bleed in the game. That right there was nerfed. In fact, the Blood Flame incantations are the weakest part of this blood build, because what really makes this blood build work is actually its weapon option, specifically the Blood Fiend's Fork, which could give you some pretty solid bleed buildup, allowing you to capitalize on using something like the Lord of Blood's Exaltation, while also giving you a ton of physical damage and elemental damage. And the best part about this is that this build does best on a 50-50 split, meaning that you'd use one of the best sacred seals in the game with the Dragon Communion seal with high efficiency. So that means that you have other options outside of bleed, while still having one of the best bleed weapons in the game. Now, is it going to have the same blood loss buildup as, let's say, a Dex or an Arcane build? No. However, it is enough to trigger blood loss on most bosses before any critical phase transition, even if you're optimizing for damage. So if it has such a great weapon, why is it so low on the list? Well, there's no other real blood loss weapon that a Faith Arcane build can use. And you could easily make the argument that a lot of the Blood Flame incantations just do not do enough. They do not scale high enough to really justify them pushing up Faith any higher. Well, not only that, but also the 3 next ones are really good, with some of them kind of being broken. Which kind of brings us to number 3 on the list, which is one I believe is kind of underrated, and that's going to be Strength. Now, Strength has 2 different routes to go. You can go to a pure Strength build, or you can go to a Strength Arcane hybrid. And let's be real here, the Strength Arcane hybrid is kind of exceptional because it gets a lot of special treatment, making it kind of one of the better ones out of the two. Like, let's give an example of the special treatment. You have 2 weapons, specifically the Warped Axe and the Sword Lance, both of which have an enhanced blood loss buildup when given the blood infusion. The Warped Axe gets the blood loss buildup of a great weapon, higher than any other weapon in its class, and it swings as fast as any other light weapon. And the Sword Lance has the same blood buildup as a colossal weapon. And what both of these allow you to do is not only have more blood buildup per attack, but also optimize Ashes of War. Specifically, let's say something like the Sword Lance, you normally cannot put, let's say, repeating thrust on a colossal greatsword on a colossal weapon. However, you can put on the Sword Lance, which gives you the highest possible blood buildup for that Ash of War. However, we don't even need to look at these unique cases to make a case for strength-based bleed builds, because we have things like the Beastman's Curse Sword, which is absolutely insane in terms of both damage and blood buildup, with the only weakness being reach. And I would argue that's about on the same level as, let's say, the Scavengers or the Bandit's Curse Sword. However, strength, you do not necessarily need to go a hybrid route. You go something more like a pure strength heavy build, and use something like the Bloodflame Blade, very similar to a traditional Dex build. And with this, you could use something like the Bloodhound's Claws, the Great Stars, or the Grave Scythe. You even have the option to build any of the infusible katanas, and that's still going to be a very viable and a very powerful option. In fact, on paper, it may seem that strength builds actually may end up outperforming dex builds when it comes to bleed builds as a whole, because you have the two-handing bonus, and yes, it does have the highest damaging claws in the game. That's because a lot of the strength builds are based more on raw numbers than anything else. When in dexterity builds, there's going to be a lot of nuance. But before we go on to that, let's talk about quality real fast, because quality is very important in order to talk about the blood infusion. Specifically, when we look at the blood infusion, a lot of weapons that have a native quality scaling, something like, let's say, the backhand blades, or the bandit's curved swords, or let's say the knight's great swords, there's not really a bad way to build it. You could go for dipping into arcane a little bit, you could go dip into more of the strength side or the dex side, and for the most part, it's going to be viable. You're not going to lose out on too much damage or too much status build up. However, it is due to this ambiguity that I'm giving it more of an honorable mention than an actual rank. Quality builds also have access to 3 other weapons, the Falx, the Bloodhound's Fang, and the Wheel of Giza. And these weapons are absolutely insane to the point where I'd argue they're borderline broken. I mean, the Wheel of Giza is a multi-attack machine, and it can proc blood loss within a single charged heavy. And the Falx, with its skill alone, is probably by far the best curse sword in the game, and that is because it gives an insane amount of hyper armor, it gives you an insane amount of bleed buildup, and its forward momentum is amazing, making it so it's great in both PvP and PvE. And what about the Bloodhound's Fang? Pretty much everything about it is amazing. Its skill, its weapon attack, its unique motion values on its jump attack, it's perfect. It's perfect in every way you can imagine. The thing though is that out of the 3 weapons that are applicable to quality builds are just as viable on a pure dexterity build. And this right here is going to lead us to the top 2, Dexterity and Arcane. And this is where things get complicated, because trying to rank the difference between Dexterity and Arcane as bleed builds, it may seem simple, but there does need to be a degree of nuance. And that is because both of these stats are very, very weird. But if you ask me which one of these are better, especially in a bleed-focused build, then I would say that Dexterity typically does better in PvP, meanwhile Arcane is much better and much more geared to PvE. Not only that, Arcane does have a secret weapon, which is the reason why I'm putting Dexterity as number 2 on this list. Now, Dexterity is very weird because you don't actually want to go a hybrid build with it. You'd rather want to go a pure Dexterity build. And this for a couple of reasons. One reason is a lot of Dexterity weapons usually have native blood buildup, making something like the Bleed Infusion very redundant, especially for some of the best Dexterity weapons like the Raptor's Talons or the Nagakiba. And this is simply because the existence of Bloodflame Blade, which allows you to capitalize on the much higher physical damage of the Ki Infusion while also having the much higher blood buildup of, let's say, the Blood or the Occult Infusion. And even for weapons that do not have innate bleed buildup, let's say like the Backhand Blades or the Bandit's Curved Swords, oftentimes there's a better alternative, at least for a bleed build, and that is going to be the Curseblade Cirques or the Falx. And the reason why I'm going to say the Curseblade Cirques is better is because of the fact that it is a much better guard countering tool, and the AR difference between the 2 weapons is massive. When I say massive, it is gargantuan, as in if you were to use Cragblade, and if I was still to focus a little bit more into strength and a little bit more into arcane, I'm still not even getting close to the AR I get with the Curseblade Cirques. And when it comes to Falx, well, even though it doesn't have the highest blood loss buildup or the highest AR, its damage from its skill alone, as well as a bleed buildup from it, and the hyper armor, well, it kind of goes without saying. It effectively fixes any weakness that curved swords typically have. And all this right here is talking about options in which are similar to other builds. Dexterity builds have some very unique options, let's say the Closet Knight, which is effectively a bleed shotgun. Dexterity builds also have a lot of true combos, which makes them really great against a lot of humanoid enemies. In fact, if you want to look at where Dexterity does better than Arcane builds, it's specifically with using things like Ashes of War / skills, or if you want to use one of the more unique weapons that Dexterity has to offer. Now, when we try to compare to Arcane, I'm sorry, but what's on the Arcane side is much more versatile. You get colossal weapons, you get spears, you get everything. So when it comes to like PvE, it's by far the best. Like, let's look at curved swords, right? You could argue that the bandits curved swords are better weapons, especially on a Dexterity build, because one, they do more damage, you have more versatile damage types, and much more versatile stats effects. However, I would say that when it comes to a bleed build specifically, outside the Beastman's curved sword, you're really never going to beat the Scavengers in terms of a bleed build, at least when it comes to curved swords. You also get an added degree of convenience. You don't have to worry about applying something like Blood Flame Blade all the time. You don't have to worry about using blood grease. Are you going to be doing less damage? Yes, but it's not about damage, it's about convenience. But if we're talking about optimization here, there's some secret weapons that Arcane builds have that are absolutely insane. Specifically, the Blood Fiend weapons. And yes, the Blood Fiend weapons are also amazing on Faith builds. However, when it comes to bleed builds, these things are king. Now, these things do serve a very similar function to what they normally would on a Faith build. For example, you would still buff the Blood Fiend's Pitchfork, and you would still definitely use the heavy attack on the big chicken leg. And the real awesome part about these weapons is the fact you could get this right here all on the first new game cycle. You don't need to go to New Game Plus, you don't need somebody to hand it to you. No, get 2 Blood Fiend Pitchforks, and guess what? You have the highest bleed buildup you could ever have in the game, at least without cheating. And not only that, you also have the access to, of course, the best bleed colossal weapon in the game with a Blood Fiend's arm, which they had to nerf multiple times, and it is still absolutely broken. And before I end this, I have to top it off with one of the best weapons in the game, and that is the Moog Spear. It was stupid on release, and it is still stupid today. The amount of damage it does is incredible, and not only that, it matches very much with the stat requirements of a lot of the Blood Fiend weapons. And with that, you're also only one talisman change away from using the Rivers of Blood. And it is with that versatility of all these 4 weapons that could do effectively any damage type you'd want in the game, on top of the fact that it has a huge convenience factor. You don't have to buff, you don't have to grease, and you really don't have to optimize your build, and these builds remain exceptionally consistent, making them, in my personal opinion, the best bleed builds in the game. Hey guys, thank you for getting this far in the video. I really do appreciate it. I do apologize for not uploading more, but I feel like we're gonna have plenty much more time for that. Night Rain just had its anniversary, so I'm gonna go ahead and cover some things on that, hopefully in shorts and maybe even in a mainline video. Thank you very much and have an awesome day.